This experience happened to me in 2018. I had just gone through a messy breakup and needed to clear my head, so I decided to take a week-long solo camping trip to Olympic National Park in Washington. I'd been there once before with my ex, ironically, but I loved the place enough that I wasn't going to let that ruin it for me. Without getting into all the details, I'd been involved in a minor car accident about 6 months prior to this trip. I rear-ended someone at a red light because I was fumbling with my GPS. It was totally my fault and my insurance covered everything. But the other driver was this middle-aged guy who completely lost his mind over it. He kept insisting I'd given him whiplash and tried to sue me for all kinds of damages that his doctor apparently couldn't find evidence of. The lawsuit got dismissed pretty quickly, but for weeks after, he'd call me from different numbers leaving these long voicemails about how I'd ruined his life and how I was a careless person who deserved consequences. Eventually those stopped, and I figured he'd moved on. I drove up to the park on a Tuesday in late September. The summer crowds were gone and I had my pick of backcountry campsites. I hiked about 4 miles into the Hoh rainforest area, set up my tent near this massive fallen tree covered in moss. The whole forest had that damp, earthy smell and everything was so green it almost didn't look real. After setting up camp, I made some instant ramen on my camp stove and ate it while sitting on the log. The plan was to spend 3 nights here, do some day hikes, and just disconnect from everything. That first night was perfect. No service on my phone, just the sound of the forest and the occasional animal moving through the brush. I read for a while using my lantern and fell asleep pretty early. The next morning I packed a small day bag and headed out to explore some trails deeper into the forest. I was gone for maybe 5 hours. When I got back to my campsite, something felt off immediately. My tent was exactly how I'd left it, zipped up and everything. But there was something sitting on top of the log where I'd eaten dinner the night before. It was a plastic water bottle, not mine. I only drink from my Nalgene, and this was some generic store brand, half empty. I stood there staring at it for a good minute trying to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker passed through and left it by accident. But that didn't make sense because my campsite was off the main trail, and you had to deliberately walk to it. The uneasy feeling in my stomach got worse when I walked closer and saw there was a piece of paper wrapped around the bottle, held in place with a rubber band. I pulled it off and unfolded it. Written in blue ink were the words, "You should be more careful." My hands started shaking. I looked around the forest in every direction but saw nothing except trees and ferns and moss. The forest was completely still. I went to my tent and checked inside. Nothing had been moved or taken. All my gear was exactly where I'd left it. I tried to convince myself this was some weird coincidence. Maybe this was left by a ranger or something, but that phrase kept repeating in my head. You should be more careful. The same thing that guy from the accident had screamed at me in the parking lot after it happened. I decided to stay another night anyway. I didn't want to let paranoia win, and I told myself I was overreacting. That evening, I started a small fire and heated up some soup. I kept the bear spray within arm's reach the whole time, even though I knew damn well a bear wouldn't leave me a note. When it got dark, I let the fire die out and climbed into my tent. I barely slept. Every sound had me wide awake, gripping the bear spray, waiting for footsteps or voices or anything. Morning came and nothing had happened. I felt stupid for being so worked up. I packed up another day bag and headed out for a different trail, this one leading to a waterfall about 3 miles north. The hike helped calm my nerves. I spent a good hour at the waterfall just sitting on the rocks and watching the water. For a while I forgot about the bottle and the note entirely. I got back to camp in the late afternoon. The log was empty this time, but when I walked around to the other side of my tent, I saw boot prints in the soft mud that definitely weren't there that morning. They were bigger than mine. They circled my tent multiple times and then led back toward the main trail. That did it for me. I started packing up my stuff as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there watching me, but the forest stayed empty and silent. I got everything shoved into my pack and started back toward the trailhead. It was about 4 miles, and the sun was already getting low in the sky. I was maybe 2 miles in when I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Not trying to be quiet, just walking at a steady pace maybe 50 feet back, the sound of boots crunching on the trail. I didn't look back. I just started moving faster, my pack bouncing against my shoulders, and the footsteps behind me matched my pace. Then they started getting closer. I could hear them clearer now. Maybe 30 feet back, my whole body went cold. I pulled out the bear spray and held it ready and shouted back that I was armed. The footsteps didn't stop. They just kept coming at that same steady pace. I practically jogged the rest of the way to the trailhead. When I finally saw my car in the parking lot, I almost cried with relief. The footsteps had faded somewhere in the last quarter mile, but I didn't slow down to check. I threw my pack in the back seat and got in and locked the doors immediately. My hands were still shaking as I shoved the key in the ignition. That's when I noticed my car looked different somehow. Something about the windshield. I sat there for a second trying to figure out what was wrong, and then I saw it. There was something white tucked under the driver's side wiper blade. I didn't want to get out of the car. I sat there staring at it through the windshield, my heart pounding, knowing I had to see what it was but terrified at the same time. Finally, I unlocked the door and stepped out, grabbed it and got back inside as fast as possible. It was a printed photo of me, sitting on the rocks at the waterfall earlier that day. On the back, someone had written, "Glad you're enjoying yourself." I drove straight to the ranger station and showed them everything. They took it seriously and said they'd increase patrols in that area and try to check any trail cameras. But they also said the park was huge, and if someone wanted to stay hidden, it wouldn't be hard. They asked if I had any idea who might do this, and I told them about the guy from the accident. They suggested I file a report with the police back home, which I did as soon as I got back. Nothing ever came of it. The guy from the accident had an alibi, apparently. He was at work the whole week I was gone. So either he hired someone, or I'm wrong about who it was. I still don't know for sure. The police said it could have been anyone, that sometimes people fixate on strangers for random reasons. That somehow made it worse. For months after, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, checking my back seat before getting in my car, that whole routine. It's been over 7 years now and nothing else has happened. No more notes, no more photos, nothing. I haven't been camping alone since then, and I don't know if I ever will again. I still think about those boot prints circling my tent, and wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed that third night like I'd planned. My sister and I started going camping together about 3 years ago. She's 5 years older than me and moved out when she turned 21. But we still make time for trips like this. Last September, right before it got too cold, we decided to do one more weekend trip. I had just turned 18 and was working a lot, so it felt good to get away. I've always been on the smaller side compared to other guys my age, never really hit that growth spurt that everyone else seemed to get. Even at 18, I still looked like I could pass for 15, which my sister liked to joke about. Standing next to her, I still looked like her baby brother. And honestly, that was fine with me. We'd gotten close over these camping trips, and I trusted her completely out in the woods. For this particular trip, we chose a spot neither of us had been to before. My sister found it through some hiking forum, where someone had posted coordinates and a basic description. The post said it was secluded and peaceful, good for people who wanted to get away from the crowded state park campsites. That sounded perfect to us. The trailhead was about 2 hours from where I lived. We got there around noon on a Saturday and started hiking in. The trail itself was pretty easy, mostly flat with a few rocky sections. It took us about an hour and a half to reach the campsite. When we got there, it was exactly what the post had described. A clearing surrounded by thick woods with a fire pit made of stacked stones in the center. There was even a log that had been dragged over to sit on. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing and spent the afternoon filtering water from a nearby stream and organizing our gear. My sister was telling me about her new job and asking me about my plans after graduation. It was nice and relaxing. As it started getting darker, we made dinner over the fire. We were sitting there eating when my sister stopped mid-sentence and stared at something behind me. I turned around but didn't see anything unusual, just trees and shadows. When I asked her what was wrong, she shook her head and said it was nothing, that she thought she saw something move. I figured it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But then she got up and walked over to the edge of the clearing, looking down at the ground. She crouched there for a while before standing back up and returning to the fire. The mood seemed quieter after that. Once we finished eating, my sister said she wanted to check something and asked me to come with her. We walked over to where she had been crouching earlier. She pointed at the ground with her flashlight. There were footprints in the soft dirt, boot prints that looked pretty fresh. She moved the light along the ground and I could see the prints going in a circle around our entire campsite, like someone had walked the perimeter. I asked her if they could be ours from when we set up camp. She put her boot next to one of the prints. The print was at least 2 sizes bigger than hers and 4 sizes bigger than mine. Neither of us said anything for a while. My sister finally told me they might be old, from whoever made the fire pit, and that we shouldn't worry about it. We went back to the fire, but I could tell she was on edge. She kept looking out into the darkness beyond the firelight. I tried to keep the conversation going, but she was barely responding. After about half an hour, she stood up suddenly and told me to stay put. She grabbed her flashlight and walked toward her tent. I watched her bend down and pick something up from near the entrance. She held it up in the light. It was a cigarette butt. She walked around slowly, checking the area around both tents with her flashlight. Then she came back and showed it to me up close. It looked recent, not old and weathered. My sister asked me if I smoked. I told her no, and reminded her that she didn't either. She nodded and threw the cigarette butt into the fire. She sat back down, but I could see her jaw was clenched. I asked her if we should leave. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared into the fire for a long time. Then she looked at me and said we would wait until morning. It was too dangerous to hike the trail in the dark. But she told me we were going to sleep in shifts, and that I should go rest first while she stayed up. I went to my tent, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. I lay there for maybe an hour, listening to every sound outside. At some point I must have dozed off because I woke up to my sister unzipping my tent. She leaned in and whispered for me to pack my things as quietly as possible. The urgency in her voice made my heart race. I asked her what was wrong, but she just kept repeating for me to pack up, to only take the essentials. I stuffed my sleeping bag and some clothes into my backpack. When I climbed out, my sister was already taking down her tent in the darkness. The fire had been put out. I started to ask her again what happened, but she cut me off and told me we needed to go. We left most of our gear there and started back down the trail using only one flashlight to guide us. My sister was in front, moving fast. I had to almost jog to keep up with her. We didn't talk the entire hike back. Even when we reached the car and started driving, my sister stayed quiet. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and she kept checking the rearview mirror. I asked her multiple times what she saw out there. She wouldn't answer me. Her face was pale, and her eyes were locked on the road ahead. I kept pushing, asking her what could have been so bad that we had to leave everything and hike out in the middle of the night. She just shook her head and told me she didn't want to talk about it. The way she said it made me stop asking. Even after we got home, she refused to tell me. Anytime I brought up that camping trip, she would change the subject or leave the room. I was 18 at the time, technically an adult, but my sister has always been protective of me in that way older siblings are. I think she didn't want me carrying around whatever she had seen that night. It wasn't until 3 years later that I finally found out. We were at her apartment having dinner, and somehow we got on the topic of worst vacation experiences. I mentioned a bad hotel I stayed at, and she laughed. Then her face got serious, and she asked me if I still thought about that camping trip. I told her I did all the time, and I wished she would just tell me what happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she put down her fork and looked at me. She said that while I was asleep in my tent, She heard movement in the woods. She saw a figure standing between the trees about 40 feet from the campsite. At first it was just a shadow, but then the person stepped forward slightly, and she could make out more details in the dim light from the fire. It was a man, and he was holding a rifle pointed directly at her. She described his clothes as torn and filthy, like he had been living out there for a long time. She said she sat completely frozen, not knowing if he could see her clearly or if moving would make him shoot. But what she said she remembered most, what still bothered her to this day, were his eyes. Even from that distance, she could see they were bloodshot and dull red, like he was extremely drunk or on something. She said it was the look of someone who wasn't thinking clearly, someone who could do anything. She waited, not moving, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, he lowered the rifle slightly and took a step back into the shadows. She didn't know if he was leaving or just repositioning. She used that moment to move as quietly as she could to my tent. She didn't want to yell and alert him that she was doing something. My sister told me she thinks he had been robbing campsites or worse. There was no way someone stays out in the woods like that, armed and watching people, unless they had bad intentions. Her best guess was that he was waiting for us to fall asleep so he could go through our stuff. Or maybe he had done worse things to other campers and we just got lucky that she saw him first. I actually kept going camping for those 3 years before I knew the truth. Went on a few more trips with friends. Even went once by myself. But after hearing what really happened that night, I haven't gone since. When I close my eyes now, I can picture that man standing in the darkness with a rifle, aimed at my tent while I slept completely unaware. Camping was never really my thing. I'd always preferred staying indoors. But the summer I turned 29, my girlfriend kept bringing up the idea of a camping trip. She'd been planning it for weeks, and eventually I gave in and agreed to go. I'll call her Maria to keep her privacy. Maria was serious about camping and hiking. She owned a 2016 Toyota Tacoma that she used specifically for trips like this, and the truck bed was always packed with gear she'd collected over the years. She wasn't interested in the popular campgrounds with designated spots and facilities. She liked finding remote areas on public land where hardly anyone went. We headed out to the desert regions east of San Diego, drove for about 2 hours before she turned onto a dirt road that didn't look like it got much use. We followed it for another 20 minutes, the truck bouncing over rocks and through dried creek beds, until she pulled off near a cluster of Joshua trees. The spot had a view of the surrounding hills and was flat enough for her tent. Maria mentioned that this area didn't seem to get many visitors based on how overgrown the road was and the lack of any fire rings or trash. She said that's what made it perfect. We arrived around 5:30 in the afternoon. The sun was still up, but Maria insisted we needed to set everything up before dark, because the temperature would drop quickly. We put up the tent and laid out our sleeping bags inside. She had a portable camping stove and started heating water for the freeze-dried meals she'd packed. The food wasn't great, but I kept that opinion to myself. After eating, we sat in our folding chairs and watched the sunset. The sky shifted through shades of orange and purple, and I started to see the appeal of what Maria enjoyed about being out here. The silence was different from anything in the city. Maria said she wanted to do some stargazing later, and suggested we skip making a campfire so the light wouldn't interfere with our view of the sky. I agreed, even though the idea of sitting in complete darkness made me a little uneasy. About an hour after the sun went down, we heard an engine. It sounded like it was coming from the same dirt road we'd used to get here. Maria glanced at me and said it was probably just someone else looking for a place to camp. We watched the darkness, and eventually saw headlights moving slowly toward us. The vehicle stopped maybe 200 yards away, close enough that we could make out the shape of it. It looked like a van or large SUV. The headlights shut off. After that, we couldn't see much, just the dark outline of the vehicle sitting there. Maria said people camp in this area sometimes, but something felt strange to me. Why stop that close when there was so much open space in every direction? We sat quietly for a few minutes and then we heard a scream. A man's voice, yelling out. It came from the direction of where the vehicle had parked. Maria looked at me and said, "He probably stepped on something or got surprised by a snake." The desert had plenty of them, especially at night. I asked if we should go check on him, but she shook her head and said we were too far away to really help and didn't want to spend the rest of the night worrying about it. It was probably nothing serious, just a scare. We listened for a bit longer, but didn't hear anything else after that. We stayed in our chairs for another 30 minutes, keeping our voices low. I kept looking over toward where the vehicle had parked, but there was no sign of a campfire or flashlights or any movement. Just the shape in the darkness. Our own camp was tucked pretty well behind the Joshua trees, and without a fire going, I doubted anyone could see us from that distance. Maria said we should get some sleep. We went into the tent and zipped it closed. I lay in my sleeping bag trying to relax, but my mind kept going back to that vehicle. I'd been lying there for about an hour when I heard the engine start up again. I sat up and listened carefully. The sound grew fainter, like it was driving away. I unzipped the tent and looked out. I couldn't see headlights or taillights, but the engine noise was definitely fading into the distance. I felt better after that and eventually fell asleep. I woke up to Maria shaking my shoulder. It was still dark, but the sky had started to turn gray with early morning light. She told me to get up and look outside. Her voice was calm, but something in it was wrong. I followed her out of the tent. She pointed toward where the vehicle had been the night before. In the growing light, I could see it was gone. But there was something else now, closer to our position. Maybe 70 or 80 feet away, there was a pile of items on the ground. Maria grabbed a flashlight from the truck and we approached it slowly. As we got closer, the details became clear. It was camping gear, a tent that had been torn or sliced open, a sleeping bag pulled halfway out of it, a backpack tipped over with clothes scattered around. There was a camp stove on its side and a water bottle lying in the dirt. We stopped about 10 feet away. Maria swept her flashlight across everything, and that's when I noticed the dark stains on the sleeping bag splattered across the inside of the destroyed tent. The stains looked black under the flashlight, but I understood what they were. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Maria grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward our truck. We didn't bother packing things properly, just threw everything into the bed as fast as we could. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to fold the tent. We climbed into the truck and Maria started driving back the way we'd come. I tried calling 911 but had no signal. We drove for 15 minutes before my phone showed one bar. I called and explained to the operator what we'd found and did my best to describe where we'd been camping. They said they'd send someone out. We made it to the paved road and pulled over to wait. A sheriff's truck showed up about 25 minutes later. We went through the whole story with the deputy, told him where we'd camped and where we found the destroyed site. He asked about the vehicle from the night before. I described it as a van or large SUV, but admitted I couldn't identify the color or any other details because of the darkness. He took notes and said we were free to go, that someone would contact us if they needed more information. The drive back to the city was silent. A few days later, a detective called and asked me to repeat everything again. He wouldn't give me details, but confirmed they'd located the campsite and were looking into it. He wanted to know if I could remember anything else about the vehicle. I told him I wished I could, but it had been too dark. That was 8 months ago. I've searched the news a few times but never found anything about it. I don't know if they caught whoever did it or even identified the victim. Maria sold her truck a couple months later and hasn't brought up camping since. The scream we heard that night wasn't from the person in the van. The Joshua trees and the lack of a campfire kept us hidden in the dark, and whoever was driving that van never knew we were there.